We are now beginning our third panel, The Business of Design. This is going to be moderated by George Thrush. George is the director of the School of Architecture here at Northeastern. He is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and a prolific writer on the contemporary city with a specific interest, I would say, from what I've read, in specific interest in the role of architecture and urban design as systems within the city that we might reorganize for greater efficiency and sustainability, both economic and environmental. George, welcome, and look forward to your discussion.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay. Well, thank you all for sticking with us. We're entering. Okay. We're in the home stretch here. This is today's final panel. And I think among the things that we've learned already, or been reminded of already, is the fundamentally interdependent and complex nature of thinking about sustainable cities. Obviously, we thought that when we put these panels together, in the sense that every panel talks about design in the context of something else, whether it's design in the context of science, design in the context of policy, or in this case, design in the context of business and commerce and filthy lucre and the rest. Clearly building and maintaining a sustainable city is a complex enterprise. There are the interests of design are in constant interaction with those of business, science, and policy, to say nothing of taste, politics, and logistics. There's all kinds of moving parts when we have this conversation. But how does design interact with business? Michelangelo had Lorenzo de' Medici. He had a patron, one was funded by the other. But our relationships today in creating sustainable cities are more complex, and the world has continued to change. The ownership of major real estate in Boston and other cities is now likelier to be held by real estate investment trusts, or REITs, for example, as opposed to traditional banks and local developers with a greater sense of history and long-term connection with the city. One of the things we'll probably want to talk about is what the consequences of that change might be for sustainable cities moving forward. So to help us understand these issues, we have four outstanding guests. And I'm going to introduce all four of them at once and then ask that they come up here to say their brief little bits before we have our conversation. So I'll start with number two here, Daniel Adams, who is an assistant professor here in the School of Architecture in the Urban Landscape program. He operates Landing Studio with partner Marie Law Adams. Landing Studio is a design, planning, and production studio that develops tactics for positively integrating active global industries and infrastructures into their local contexts, or landing. Since 2004, Landing Studio has worked on projects with port operating companies and communities in Boston and New York through the design of shared industrial dock and public park infrastructure, light projections, festivals, museum operations, tours, operations buildings, and industrial community operations agreements, and has consulted in the U.S. and globally on development concepts for industrial and post-industrial waterfronts. Next to Dan in the dark sweater is Paul McMorrow. Paul is the associate editor of Commonwealth Magazine. He is also a regular contributor to the Boston Globe op-ed page, including today. For those of you who read the paper, I'm looking at you students in the back. It's really not a bad thing to do. He also writes about development and housing. Prior to Commonwealth, he covered commercial real estate for Banker and Tradesman and worked as a contributing editor at Boston Magazine and as news and features editor for the Weekly Dig. His writing also appears regularly in Beer Advocate magazine. You can question him about that later. I've already done so. Closest to me is Ronald Drucker, president of the Drucker Company. In addition to being a great friend and supporter of our school, Ron has been involved in a variety of development activities encompassing retail, hotel, residential, and office projects. His most recent focus has been on urban mixed-use developments, including the Heritage on the Garden in Boston's Back Bay, or on the Public Garden, and Atelier 505 in Boston's South End. Both of these complexes were recognized by the Urban Land Institute by winning the coveted Oscar of the profession, the ULI Award for Design Excellence. Mr. Drucker is a graduate of Franklin and Marshall College, the Columbia Graduate School of Business, and was a Loeb Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he was also a member of the urban design faculty from 1975 to 1983. He is active on many civic, educational, and cultural boards. Finally, at the far end of the table, Jim Doolin, who is the Acting Chief Development Officer for Economic Planning and Development at Massport, the Massachusetts Port Authority. Mr. Doolin is responsible for authority-wide strategic and master planning activities and directs the planning and development process for commercial development of Massport's properties that is undertaken by private development interests. Since 1985, over $800 million in private mixed-use development has been undertaken on port property, with an additional 4 million square feet of mixed-use development planned. Mr. Doolin is also responsible for transportation and infrastructure planning, including public open space, to support the authority's mission for critical port and airports activities, as well as in support of commercial development. Mr. Doolin also oversees Massport's design review process that includes a focus on sustainable design and construction. I'm delighted to have such a great panel to work with, and Dan, if you'd like to go first. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dan Adams. When I first got the text, actually, from George and Jane inviting me to participate in this conference, I was very intrigued by one specific question that was listed, and they showed it at the beginning of this symposium in general, the question of making the city work and how do we make the city work. And I guess there's sort of two ways that I was intrigued by that question. One is with maybe a sense of panic that I think maybe we're all encountering a little bit right now with these issues of climate change, very large, resource depletion and explosive population growth, and really trying to think about how the city will work in the future. And then the other way of reading it, which I think cuts more to my core, I suppose, is the notion of making a city work, making it a productive machine. And I quite like the precedent we saw just a minute ago, the electric positive architecture, right? The idea that a city should not just be something that we bank on for our survival, but in fact actually is a productive machine for our cities. And to me, the sort of central battleground of this question is actually the urban waterfront. I think it, in fact, has always been the central battleground, in that it's always been the source of urbanism around the world, principally to do with its dynamism, right, and its overlapping value. And this Venn diagram, I'm going to show a lot of Venn diagrams, I think sums this up, right? We don't ask necessarily a lot of streets, we don't necessarily ask a lot of rail lines, but we ask an incredible amount of urban waterfront. We ask that they simultaneously function for ecological value, recreational benefit, real estate, and industrial capacity. And at the center of that is, of course, the urban waterfront. So for me, it becomes a question of how much can an urban waterfront do? Now, historically, this has been a sort of a complex question because we've sort of had a difficult time. The title of this slide should actually be Plural Infrastructure, because it's a question that, when you look at Manhattan as maybe the token example of this being an aerial photograph from the 1950s, but you can see quite immediately the sort of expansion of the iron grid into the water, and the understanding that that waterfront was essentially the sort of gateway between the city and the world, and it was the point at which all this different infrastructure could essentially launch from the city and arrive into the city. And then sequentially, over the 50 years, we of course come to understand the more contemporary context and contemporary perception of Manhattan, and you see a series of various sort of landmark projects on the right, and the translation of what I would say of one piece of singular infrastructure into another piece of singular infrastructure, stripping the sort of industrial or infrastructural capacity of a landscape and converting it into maybe perhaps more of a recreational capacity. And that, of course, brings tremendous value and benefit to an urban environment. The consequence, which has often gone unseen, is, but has actually become very apparent very recently, would be, for example, a couple of years ago in 2007, when the I-35 West Bridge collapsed, crossing the Mississippi River just outside Minneapolis, unfortunately killing 13 people. This Manhattan, as their planning agency, reacted quite aggressively and actually lowered their bridge weights from 105,000 pounds to 80,000 pounds. And when you subtract the weight of the truck from that equation, what you discover is in one piece of legislation, they in fact doubled the quantity of trucks necessary to deliver all goods into Manhattan. And what they had discovered in that was that, in fact, the sort of capacity which had once existed on the waterfront had been eliminated. And while many companies that we in fact consult and work with and essentially research and study started asking, well, are there other ways that we can get goods into the city? This has become so inefficient that in fact we would prefer to use barging now once again, which is a far more fuel-efficient transportation method. They scoured Manhattan only to come to the inevitable conclusion that in fact no, that entire industrial infrastructure had been eliminated, and now in fact no goods are brought into or out of Manhattan by barge nor train. Now, so the question then becomes what has been lost, and is there ways to sort of counter this? And that to us brings the concept of plural infrastructure, as opposed to thinking about sort of the discrepancy of one to the other, the either or, is there a both and? So the first lesson that we look at in this is the question of the scale of sustainability and the recognition that sustainability as a concept is not scalable, right? So what is often perceived as a regional sustainable strategy, in fact, fails at the local level, and what is often seen as a local scale of sustainability is in fact perhaps even damaging to the regional efficiency of an environment. These are two examples. Both are examples. One is in Staten Island, New York, along the KULL. The KULL is perhaps the most significant industrial waterway on the east coast of the United States. It's the access point for Port Newark. And down below is our Chelsea Creek, which is one of the most active industrial corridors in Boston Harbor. And in both cases, in the case, you might all be aware of the post-Panamax dredging that's going on in New York. It's in fact the largest piece of industrial development ever in the history of New York, is the deepening of New York Harbor for post-Panamax vessels. And as part of that, for example, that bridge, the Bayonne Bridge, is being elevated at a cost of $1 billion, and over the last 10 years they've been actually sinking the water depth from 45 feet to 55 feet at the cost of approximately $1.6 billion. Now, while that is all ongoing, what we see is the sort of amount of abandoned land immediately adjacent to the Bayonne Bridge. So despite all of this investment, all of those intentions are for naught if, in fact, the regional interest of bringing in larger vessels and the efficiency of bringing in larger vessels is compromised by, let's say, local interests that, in fact, prohibit those industries from landing. Hence, what we see is the concept of regional sustainability, which is often sort of dictated by, let's say, federal or regional legislation, and the contradiction of that is often born in more local sustainability initiatives. In the case of Massachusetts and Boston Harbor, for example, the state has very rigid legislation that requires that historically maritime industrial waterfronts are preserved as maritime industrial waterfronts, and city legislation actually specifically excludes maritime industrial development, allowing only for the development of parks and residential development on the waterfront, accordingly leading to the examples of stagnation we had seen before. And much of this is because, in fact, while the region might see value in large-scale industrial and infrastructural development, the city sees no value of it coming into its environment. What we look to do in our work and our research is to start studying ways of designing these facilities to be plural. And that leads to the next point of that sustainability is a density of use, not necessarily a density of buildings. And it raises the question as the architect, as the choreographer, right? To look at a facility and not treat this as something that is designed statically, but as something that is actually designed as a changing sort of morphology through time. In this case, we're looking at a salt dock, which we've been working with, which is simultaneously being used to unload wind turbines that were in that case due for Everett. In the summer times, identifying the specific opportunities of the salt to be consolidated and open that large and infrastructural landscape for public uses in the summer. And in the bottom, the analysis by us as architects to determine the sort of soft spots within an industrial development to determine where it's possible to insert new forms of ecological planting and recreation for the city. And in the context of business of design, where this leaves us as architects is the question of essentially how we function and how we perform and how we work as architects, as opposed to understanding architecture as, again, a static, fixed element. We, I would say, lobby for the concept of the architect in residence, an architect that is actually reactive and responsive to every dimension of the operations and brings creative and design thinking across even the most, let's say, minute or temporary aspects of the architecture.
Let's see here. So, Paul.
Was under strict orders by George to keep this to 5 minutes and 5 minutes only. So just want to riff on a couple ideas real quick and hopefully set the table for some back and forth. The notion of the business of design is a lot of what I work through in the Globe every week. And for me, just want to kind of talk a little bit about the way, the framework that I approach this as a journalist as opposed to a practitioner. For me, it's about understanding, quantifying, managing, and working through, from an intellectual point of view, conflict, and the conflict that the business of development instigates. Because there are no, if you think about the city, there are no real gated communities in the city the way there are in the suburbs. Every piece of private development is also a piece of public infrastructure. Sorry, I got my notes on my phone here. Because of the way that we treat cities as shared public spaces, you think about the original rationale for zoning, which is we all, as a populace, as a city, we can control what you do with your piece of public land because what you build affects us. And every developer who builds a project, by building in the city, you're necessarily ceding a bit of control, sovereignty over your own land in exchange for the benefits that we all create for each other. And when you think about that in a business standpoint, designers, you have distinct sets of customers for your business, and the interests are not always and not often aligned. You have the interests of the private developer who has investors and needs to make a return for them, and you have the customer, the citizenry for whom the development project is a piece of public infrastructure, and we expect certain things, certain public benefits to flow from this piece of private development. We expect good streetscapes. We expect first floor public spaces, be they restaurants, retail. We ask developers to help us fund public infrastructure. And, it boils, and ultimately, this discussion it comes to a head on questions of use, questions of form, questions of height, and so we've got the permeability between the public and the private, and which leads, the public aspect and the private aspect, which leads to these conflicting uses. And I just wanted to, where's my, there we go. Just wanted to kind of, when we talk about the way that this conflict filters through in the real world, wanted to just spotlight two projects with two relatively similar sets of parameters that went to vastly different directions. On the left, we have Columbus Center, which was Columbus Center and Fenway Center. Columbus Center at the intersection of the Back Bay and the South End, over the Turnpike, and Fenway Center at Kenmore Square. Two air rights developments building over the same roadway, owned by the same public landlord, and they end up in vastly different places based on the different ways that the developers interact with this kind of messy public process. Columbus Center is in the public process for 3+ years, 120 public meetings. All the while, the market is getting away from them. The public agency landlord demands that in their rights development, there's no land to build on. You have to actually build the deck and then build your buildings on top. The Turnpike asks that the developer fund the cost of the deck up front, all the while paying them rent. Not sure from which cash flow. They have no project to generate cash to pay the rent with, but they're being asked to pay rent. The design program is premised on, it's heavy on hotel and luxury condos, which by the time they emerge from the permitting process, they're chasing a declining market downhill. They respond with a very public, very expensive, and ultimately very illegal effort to court public officials for public subsidies. They throw a bunch of illegal money at federal, state, and city officials. They don't get their subsidies. The project ends up belly up, and the development LLC winds up on Fan Pier in the Innovation District at the federal courthouse, pleading guilty and paying a $1.6 million fine. Fenway Center, basic same set of parameters. From a design perspective, you've got a little bit more land to deal with, so it's easier. It's a cheaper kind of from a structural standpoint. But learning from the example of Columbus Center, the Turnpike takes a completely different point of view from the finance end. Instead of asking the developer to pay rent up front, works out a way in which they'll get rent credits. So the public entity is building the public infrastructure that allows the private development to take place in a partnership. No one makes money until they both make money, and at the same time, you have a neighborhood that's very supportive politically of the project, and which not to say it's been fast, but it's been much less painful. The design program is thoroughly, straightly aimed at affordable and market rate units for young urban customers, offices aimed at Longwood Medical Center, parking for Longwood and the Red Sox, and the end result is they have $450 million in cash. They don't need a penny of a loan from a bank to make the project happen. And that's what we got. Hopefully we set the table and let's dig into it.
Thank you. Jim? Oops. Okay. Well, that's the end. That's fine. That's fine. Okay, we'll just...
Good afternoon. It might be a fatal flaw to be at a design symposium and have absolutely no images to show, but we'll risk it. For context for my remarks, I wanted to first give you a little context about what I do and my motivations as a landowner. And I have to do some full disclosure within my 5 minutes as well. Professor Tim Love is our design review consultant. He doesn't happen to be here today, so I can tell many stories and nobody can verify whether they're true or not. Secondly, we have had a string of fantastic interns from Northeastern's architectural group, so we're very excited to be here, and they're terrific. And we make them do real work. So that's, I hope they get a lot out of it too.
So do we, Jim.
I wanted to talk about design in the broadest terms and how it contributes to value creation and commercial real estate within Massport's portfolio. You probably will think after my remarks that this is a well-organized panel because Dan has covered the working waterfront and I don't have to do that. So I was going to announce I'm focusing on commercial real estate and not the port or the airport today, but give you the Massport perspective. So we own Logan, Hanscom, Worcester, the Port of Boston, many facilities, and of course we have over 100 acres of land for commercial real estate on the waterfront in Boston. As an institutional or public landowner, I want to focus on how we structure things and what our approach is in using design for value creation. Of course, we operate under long-term ground leases, which puts us in a partnership position with private third-party developers. We don't sell land and move on. So that's one kind of mechanical piece that keeps us in a partnership with a small p, and we become the landlord. We have, as George mentioned in the introduction, over 4 million square feet of commercial real estate developed on our property in Boston Harbor, and we're about halfway there with respect to our remaining build-out. So we have a long-term perspective in that we're really not going anywhere. We're around to stay. We have no exit strategy to our real estate investments. So in that sense, I have, upon occasion, when frustrated with a developer we're negotiating with, called myself an urban farmer. I'm just a simple farmer trying to work the land and get the most return out of the land sustainably over the period of time that we have. And that's the business part that we're in from Massport's perspective. But we are self-financing. We receive no tax revenue. So my job is to generate revenue to the bottom line for Massport's bottom line. So I want to be very attuned to the role of design in value creation. So our business model for design. So we invest in design as a landowner in 3 different ways at least. Design guidelines that, let's say a professor at Northeastern had a consulting firm, and let's say somebody hired them to develop design guidelines, which we take very seriously on our South Boston waterfront properties. We also undertake design review, and we do that jointly with the BRA, which creates a process where in years past it might have been seen as a little bit of a ping pong ball between 3 different entities. It works very beautifully with respect to a joint design review process with the city and Massport, because as you all know, as an independent state authority, we are not subject to zoning. So, and maybe John and I could debate that in another session. But I think that we also have put capital and operating dollars into high-quality public open spaces. And it's kind of a traditional way of thinking about redevelopment in terms of roads and public open space. As the Big Dig was out there ripping up the South Boston waterfront, we're planning. And as an earlier panel mentioned, South Boston waterfront was not on anybody's mental map of a place to go recreate, live, or invest. So we had to foresee value creation and creating an address in an area that had no address previously. So our investments in design and open space creation have that strategy. But we wanted to position the open space in a way that it brought value to multiple parcels. So please visit the waterfront in South Boston Maritime Park, which is positioned almost like the opening to a river delta to the ocean, adding value to a series of parcels around the perimeter rather than development on the water's edge. We have put open space in a key location on D Street. Another aspect to what I wanted to comment on was land value and building design. So you may know that the South Boston waterfront is certainly in the top 5 of the best urban sub-district real estate markets currently in the United States. It is hot. Values are accelerating and so forth, which traditionally would translate themselves into taller buildings. But because I represent the Port Authority, which owns and operates Logan Airport, planes take off over South Boston, not without its controversy a decade ago with respect to building height, but it shapes a design box within which land value is driving the full bulk of that box to about 240 to 260 feet maximum building height. And traditional zoning then does not control building height per se in the South Boston waterfront. So as a result, we have this, for designers, a difficult recipe of squeezing squeezing a high demand for FAR with land value. Height can't be used, massing is difficult, and it stresses budgets on every level of the building, and certainly stresses the skin of the building, of which we in the public realm are very, we've seen some uneven results, I'd be honest. And finally, however, two buildings I would point to that are a little different is the John Hancock building and the Vertex building now under construction, which are essentially owner-occupied buildings and able to put cash on the table for their image of what they want to do in the waterfront as distinguished from a commercially financed building. And finally, we are interested in quality as a landowner. We believe that high quality will, our ground leases, we operate as a % of gross revenue. So every increment of value we can create creates return to us on the bottom line. And the views and the value of the water, literally, are something we're trying to maximize with open space and orientation of streets. And very recently, we are insisting that designers and developers actually undertake a very disciplined methodology to demonstrate to us how value is being created by the actual layout and architecture of the buildings and capturing the value of the water against the asset classes of office, apartments, and even hotels. Thanks.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Jim. Okay, well, I really couldn't have asked for a better setting of the table, as Paul put it, for a conversation about business and design than these four presentations. Jim alluded to... yes, oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Sorry about that. Sir?
Well, I don't have any images, and you almost didn't have me. When I grow up, I don't want to be subject to zoning either. You're looking at a dinosaur who's not a REIT, who doesn't have a public fund, and who hires architects one at a time and works with them. By the way, we don't do things called centers, just to be clear. The business of design, what is that? Is that the impact that design has on business? Is it the impact which is micro that it has on the specific building? Is it macro in terms of the urban design and the impact that it has on a city? I had to ask George a number of times, what is it you want me to talk about? You want me to talk about how we try to beat architects up on the fees? You want me to... And by the way, whatever fee we agree to with a designer, there's always the wine quotient, because they'll get into it, and of course, they're not efficient, and then they come back to us whining, saying we need a little more money, and so we can't stop in medias res, so we do that. But that's the wine quotient after we negotiate the deal. Don't forget that. When I taught at the GSD, I used to say, good design need not cost more. And when I've worked with some fancy architects and they're complaining about value engineering, I say, if you can't do it, who can? Well, it is true. I mean, a good designer can design with papier-mâché and have it work. Obviously, the bigger the budget, the more the architect will exceed the unexceedable budget. However, I think that good design need not cost more. We believe in design. For instance, at the Heritage, out of 87 units, there were 70 different unit types because of the articulation of the exterior. Another developer would have built a box that had 5 unit types. We had 70 out of 87. At Atelier 505 in the South End, out of 103, we had 84 different unit types. So we had to design 70 and 84 individual homes. And when you're dealing with the constraint, and they're 1,500 square feet, 2,200 square feet, 3,000 square feet, 500 square feet, whatever they are, you have to deal with the constraints of the perimeter and the depth that's within it. But we believe that there's value in good architecture which meets the market, whether it's retail, whether it's office, whether it's hotel. Look, we're in business to make money. We do like to think that whether it was in Newton Corner at exit 17, whether it was at the corner of Route 9 and 128 for the Harvard Pilgrim headquarters, whether it was at the Colonnade, whether it was at the Kenmore Hotel, which my grandfather did, and the Braemore, whether it's at Atelier 505, we'd like to think we add value to the neighborhood. And there's a symbiotic relationship between what a developer does and what the neighborhood offers and what the developer can offer in return to the neighborhood. And it's not just the extractions, the exactions, the linkage monies. It's not the mitigation monies. It's what that product is. And frankly, when you look at the business of design and you look at how hard we worked as a team, this is Machado Silvetti and Ad Inc., and we as the developer, on creating the partie, because that's design, of Atelier 505, and dealing with Warren Avenue where we wanted the building to relate to the 4 stories on Warren, that we wanted to create a plaza which would be the cynosure of the South End. And when you're there and you see people coming in and out of the theaters and being in our restaurants, and also what Barbara Lynch did across the street and what other people have done drafting off of what we did, that's the business of design. And also the business of design is we had a major risk that we took in that one particular building, and I could have had a slide of it. Anybody who knows that building, there are garden-type units in the canyon that was created by virtue of doing the 4 stories on Warren and the 9 and 10 stories on Berkeley and Tremont Street. And we turned those lemons into lemonade by creating duplex units, which we didn't want to do, but they all had gardens in the backyard, and they had terraces. So that's the business of design, where we had a macro solution in dealing in the oldest Victorian neighborhood in the country in the South End. And by the way, that zoning wasn't our idea, because if it had been our idea, it never would have happened, unless it was at Massport, okay? But it was a public-private partnership between the BRA and the BCA, and they're the ones who did that zoning. We didn't. But it was our partie which won a competition, and in order to do that, we had to take that leap. So it's the business of design is multifaceted, and it relates from the benefit to the city, it relates to the benefit of the developer and the lenders, and there better be, and then everything else in between is what it does to the fabric and the context of the neighborhood and the people it employs, the taxes it pays, and the trickle-down impact of that. So I still don't understand what the business of design means, but I think I touched on some areas, and I'm sure George will pull more out of us. And by the way, there's an old adage that you don't follow animal acts or children. Well, you don't follow public officials, journalists, or smart guys from the GSD who happen to be a recipient of a fellowship that you endowed.
Okay, well, now I think I can safely say we are ready for this conversation.
That was just a subtle reminder.
Thank you very much for making it. But both of our last speakers touched on the question of value creation. And, I think this really lies at the heart of this conversation about the relationship of design and business. Ron gave us some very specific examples of how that happens. And Atelier 505 is exactly the example I have in my notes for us to get to as well. But I want to ask maybe all of you a question at the sort of 30,000-foot level, because there has been a really significant development in the last 20 years, which is the development of these REITs, these real estate investment trusts, and the which For those who don't know what they are large funds that buy and sell real estate nationwide or probably globally. And what it means is that the ownership of large developments in cities is not local as much as it used to be. And this is why you say that you're a dinosaur in the sense that you do still, Ron still provides local ownership for the developments that he does. I wonder what the panelists think, how significant a change has that been for a city like Boston?
Let me just speak to that, and then I'll shut up. But, Boston Properties is a public company. Avalon Bay is a public company. Archstone is a public company. Equity Residential and Equity Office are public companies. They'll use pretty darn good architects. Okay, they believe in design, and without naming names, they use a lot of local architects. But I know that Boston Properties is about to embark on a project where they're going to be using an architect with a more international reputation. I don't think, in my opinion, that those firms nationally, internationally, choose for their urban projects, for their projects in Chicago, San Francisco, Washington, LA. I don't think that they choose to buy architecture on the cheap.
Well, maybe the answer to an answer is that actually it's not so much whether the ownership is local or national. It is that the developers have a genuine interest in the quality of the environment being maintained, which helps maintain the value of what they develop.
All of those people are smart people, and the difference, okay, the one difference that you find, and Boston Properties is only in, and I use them because I knew them before they were public and I know them well. They're in Boston, in Washington, and they're in San Francisco. That's basically where they are. Now, they are more involved in the community in Boston than they are in those other cities. And the one thing that we have lost, and it's a small digression, there's no Jordan Marsh, there's no John Hancock, there's no the New England Life. Those companies don't exist anymore. So no Filene's. When they were local, they were the ones who were the great philanthropists in the city, and they were the ones who supported programs for the city. That's the difference, in that I still think that the local developers are more involved in their communities and sit on boards than the other companies do in cities where they're not headquartered. Right. But I don't think it impacts their design. Right. Sorry.
I would echo that last comment that Ron made, but also maybe observe who is willing to step forward in a pioneering way. And I know I'm kind of myopic about the South Boston waterfront, but when you look at who the original investors were and who took the leap, it was a local company. It was a fairly large company, Fidelity, but it was cash. It was a cash investment towards a vision that's quite extraordinary in a way. I don't see how a REIT would have that kind of DNA about a city. And what we're seeing now is, and Joe Fallon investing in with Mass Mutual of the first apartment building and so forth on our property on the waterfront, but that has been sold, right, to J.P. Morgan. So we're seeing, if you will, a second generation of REIT investment now that value has been established. But there's still room. Liberty Wharf has changed the psychology. It's 70,000 square feet of development in total by a local developer. Now that's been recently sold. Right. So I think there's a message there about pioneering and creating the kind of city that the neighborhoods and the city of Boston want to create.
I think if we're talking about what effect does the ownership, who owns, to what degree does the identity of a building owner impact the city as we experience it every day? I think that REITs are, in the sense that REITs they're public companies, the ownership is diffuse. They are less problematic, I think, from a city point of view than private equity. Boston Properties is a REIT. We keep talking about them all the time. but they do great work, which is why we talk about them. At Russia Wharf, they were going in the ground with that skyscraper at the time when bank financing seized up. Columbus Center went down. Filene's went down. Boston Properties, because they're a REIT, floated corporate bonds. They couldn't get a bank loan. They eventually did, but the thing was too expensive to touch. And instead, they used their own balance sheet as a public company to build Atlantic Wharf from their own wallet. They're a REIT. It was a great thing. They did things that somebody like John Hines couldn't do. Hines' partner, Filene's, was Vornado. They're still in that deal. They are a REIT. They had that same financial capability to float bonds and self-finance the Filene's deal if they so choose. They did not. Happens that Boston Properties has, while they're based out of New York now, has deep institutional ties to the city. Vornado does not. Maybe that boils down. I mentioned the private equity bit a bit because they are financed in a different way. It's not based on your earnings per share, or it's not based on your net income that you report to Wall Street. It's based on entering a deal, making an increment, and then selling at an exit date. Baked into the model is the fact that you're not going to buy and hold forever, which is the Boston Properties model. So everything that you do, if you're a private equity backed deal, everything that you do to lessen your own cash flow up front is going to impact your bottom line, which is it has been theorized that that's why the Blackstone-owned buildings downtown did not enter the business improvement district. You had public companies there. You had public owners in that bid, in the deal. You had private owners in the deal. The Blackstone folks didn't get in because the more they encumber themselves on the front end right now, the less return they get on the back end. And from the point of view of what the city looks like, how it functions, for all of us, that's problematic.
Well, first of all, that's really clarifying, I think, to get these multiple perspectives on this really fundamental transformation of ownership of large real estate in high-value cities in the country. But let me shift, Dan, to another question about value creation. But in Chelsea, you're talking; it's a different kind. There's the value of we have to store our salt somewhere. It's on the industrial waterfront of Chelsea that we do so. The first thing you did was to go about making that just like a large-scale beautification project or like community engagement project, but it has continued and expanded. How does Chelsea see, how would they describe the value creation that's going on there, would you say?
Yeah, well, it's sort of a complicated question, and actually Ron mentioned one of these words that's very sort of, I guess, true to our heart, and is this concept of mitigation, which is a tricky subject. A big part of our work is looking at, oftentimes these industries are treated very generically, perhaps, and perhaps that's because a lot of times the industries operate at such a scale that they, almost exist ubiquitously in the air. You talk about companies like Global Oil or something in Boston, and no one really knows even where they're from, or they just seem to show up on your shores. And so accordingly, when those developments begin on a property, the cities usually know very little, in fact, about how they operate. And accordingly, at least outside of Massport, where a lot of industry in Boston Harbor, for example, is actually north out of Massport's property. It's up in Everett and Chelsea, which is a difficult situation because they're very small cities. Chelsea is 1.8 square miles. It's a self-governing city. It doesn't have sort of the infrastructure of an agency like Massport. Yet Chelsea Creek, which is East Boston, Chelsea, and Revere, receive about 3/4 of Massachusetts petroleum products. So you're putting an enormous amount of infrastructure into a city that maybe doesn't have the sort of political or economic infrastructure to even sort of manage or negotiate that. And accordingly, what was often happening in the past, and I've seen this in New York Harbor as well, is the concept of mitigation became essentially a way of, understanding that these industries might have certain negative impacts on the environment, and accordingly we're going to sort of offset that with a monetary fund that goes somewhere else in the city. The problem often became that it was such a generic use of the resource that it wasn't in any way responsive to the actual specific environment. And I think where the architect, who was honestly very absent in a lot of those discussions, brings a lot of value, was to actually look at the specificity of the proposed proposition and design the sort of concept of mitigation or community benefit in a more tactical and responsive way. One of the first sort of projects we did in New York was actually a sort of a dredging project off the coast of Staten Island, and it turned out while we were driving sheet piles after building the dock, they had to move the sheet piles out an additional 5 feet, which essentially eliminated a certain degree of New York Harbor habitat. The city, in a very rapid response, said, well, you owe us money then for that lost habitat. And, accordingly, they came up with a figure of $250,000 for wetland restoration, which the wetland restoration actually turned out to be putting a chain link fence around a part of Fresh Kills, which was a former landfill site in Staten Island, which is entirely on a different part of the island. So all of a sudden, what was posited as an improvement to the local environment became, and improvement to the lost habitat of that local environment became an investment halfway across New York City.
Well, this is, I think the whole idea of separating the costs and benefits of development is I mean, we could have a whole panel just on that about, in a lot of high-value cities, affordable housing, for example, can be done on-site or off-site. Various other benefits can be done in different ways. Ron, I want to talk just a little bit about Atelier 505 because it is such a successful urban intervention, I think, on many levels. I don't know if everybody here is familiar with it, but it's really a really complex mixed-use project that fills out a really historically important block. I've lived in Boston for 25 years, so I'm a newcomer, but I remember for such a long time going by that site thinking, gosh, why isn't there anything there? It's right next to the Cyclorama, which is historically a really important building. I used to see the Cyclorama painting in its Gettysburg location, but it's really a rich historical block. But that project has such a mix of projects or problems to solve or questions to answer, it seems. You described one about just reconciling the different heights of the pieces. That's sort of an architecture or lifestyle thing. But talk about was there always to be a theater there? Was that part of a community process? How did that whole mix of uses come about?
Other than the play, Mrs. Lincoln?
Yes, other than the play.
The site was owned partially by the BCA and partially by the BRM. And they decided in the early 90s, there was a theater on the site, the National Theater, which was demolished because it was falling down, which was adjacent to the Cyclorama. And there was a community process that went on for 2 or 3 years prior to us, and then there was a competition which lasted maybe 9 months. And there was no affordability component to the residential portion of the project because that was the theaters. It was 40,000 square feet, which we gave to the BCA in terms of a core and shell, plus $2 million in cash, which amounted to $11 million. Right. And that basically was the land cost. And it was an FAR per square foot at the time, which was a little excessive, but not that much. The site was very dirty. It was dirty, and we needed money from the city and from the feds and from the state and from our own pocket, because there had been gas stations there. There had been not a glue factory, but the equivalent thereof, like a dry cleaner or something, and something going back even 150 years before that was dirty. And then there was a spill which migrated from the police station's gas tank over there, so it was dirty. But there was a community process beforehand which established the basic parameters of the massing, and then there was a selection process afterwards and some more community process. It was not uncomplicated. I mean, we won the competition in February of '98. We were supposed to get into the ground on September 18th of '01. That didn't happen. I was in Pennsylvania, and the first call I made was back to our project manager, who had a check for $600,000 to the building department for our building permit, and I said, not so fast. And we sat there for, I don't know, maybe a little bit less than a month. I called the mayor because it was a public competition. Just said, look, we're not going forward right now. But our lenders stood with us, and don't ask me why, but on July 2nd of '02, we started construction, and we hit a great market. So, condominium business is a bad business because it's all about luck. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I mean, it does actually. And the funny thing that I think a lot of people don't really understand is how many kinds of value are embedded in development in high-value cities nowadays. In other words, as we have sought to create public-private partnerships for what used to in cities be entirely public enterprise, building infrastructure, taking care of public spaces and so forth, if you break down a project like Atelier 5x5, which I think is so interesting because it has so many moving parts, okay, you don't have to do the affordability thing because you're doing this other thing, and so the theater and the reclamation of that fallen down bit of cultural infrastructure is part of what we expect your bottom line to be able to support, both the service of your lenders, your profit, and then we expect you to support these other public uses. And this is, I don't know that it is fully, except for people who go to public meetings all the time, I do not know if it is fully transparent to the average citizen how much migration of what used to be paid for by the public has migrated to a mixture of public and private. I'm not saying that's evil. I'm saying it's just not transparent, I think. And Paul, there's a column for you. But Jim, you talked about the kind of different kind of value creation that you're responsible for at Massport. It's not the same as a private developer. You have to play by the rules of private development to some extent, but at the end of the day, you have other performance criteria that you have to meet that are not the same. You want to talk a little bit about that?
And we are a landowner perspective. So projects have to work. I mean, we have not directly invested in a project with Massport Capital.
And you don't subsidize things for public.
Well, this is what we do, and this is what we've done, and this is what we hope to do less and less as we go forward. And that is structure ground lease payments, not unlike what Paul was talking about with the Turnpike Authority, right, where there was one project, a front-end payment with no revenue, right, and look what happened. And then there's another project where there's a sharing of revenue going forward. And the model works for us because, again, these are 95-year leases, and we can claw back, if you will, or participate in revenue streams that essentially translate themselves in what the land's worth today, at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. So we have structured many deals that ramp up the base rent that we get, or even the participating rent we get over time, and so forth and so on, to allow investment to occur without the big mortgage. You know, it's a lease. It's a monthly payment and versus the mortgage obligation. Now, I would say that is a factor if you dial back a little bit before Joe Fallon was able to get out of the ground on Fan Pier about why you saw buildings on our property away from Four Point Channel while there was all kinds of things going on with land ownership and the McCourts and so forth and so on, and there's a novel there, but I think a structure can actually help. It's not a subsidy per se, but it's a structure that allows things but it's not for everybody. You mentioned high-value cities. This is these are sophisticated investors and lenders that understand a ground lease, and it isn't for everybody to be a part. Think of this thought. I mean, Ron would probably have a heart attack. He's going to be a partner with Massport for 95 years.
And we on the ground under 60 state.
George, can I just throw one thing
Please,
in?
please.
I think that this notion of harnessing the value that's inherent in high-value cities is not necessarily a bad thing if you go about it in a creative way. And there's a couple things happening in Cambridge right now that kind of bear keeping an eye on. Central Square, they're going through this rezoning process where there are some folks who are saying we should increase the zoning height by X. There are some people who say not at all. And the city's consultants came in and said, well, what if we increase it X plus 5, okay? And what if we could, you're going to generate more revenue, okay? And what if we use that revenue to subsidize independent businesses on the ground floor? You're creating value privately, and you're harnessing it and basically socializing it back into the community. Similar thing happening over in Kendall Square on the volition of the landowners there, where they've taken cheap restaurant leases. They've accepted cheap restaurant leases with small, independent, local businesses on the bet that having a funky independent restaurant on the ground floor of every building makes the square a more interesting place. And if 95% of your income's coming from lab and office space and not your restaurant, you can actually drive a higher rent in the floors above by having a more interesting ground floor. And so you're cross-subsidizing it up and down the building, and it flows across the neighborhood if every building kind of follows suit.
You know, this is like a perfect intersection of what we're talking about in having a conference like this. It is the intersection of a policy idea, of a financial model, and actually if the now twice mentioned Tim Love were here, he would talk about restrictions on the size of the floor plate of those of that subsidized retail, which would provide another structural impediment to having the stuff you're trying to avoid, and still have an operating market. You know, this is why sustainable cities are complicated because there's several moving parts. I think that's a really good example.
You know, in the South End, the BRA went through almost a 3-year process, running from Herald Street all the way down to the Boston Medical Center. And we own property in the so-called New York Streets area. There are incentives that allow the FAR to go from 4 to 6.5. And those incentives require 20% open space once you go beyond the threshold of the existing, as well as 5, I think the affordable component goes to 20% for residential, and there's a 5% component for the increase in any commercial space. We're looking at those options closely because we're not sure that the increased FAR at the cost justifies doing that. And we were at the table, so we disagreed with some of it because some incentives may never happen. So it's you can legislate, but it doesn't always result in the desired goal.
Well, this is one of the reasons why, and it's great to have representatives of so many different organizations here, because one of the reasons why it's absolutely essential to have financially astute people in the sort of public policy part that governs the built environment. For example, if exactly as you say, if I intend, in a well-intentioned way, I intend to create a subsidy to cause you as a private actor to do X, but it's not enough. It won't ever happen. On the other hand, if I'm crazily generous in such a way that pays you 10 times what I need to do to cause you to do something, that's also nuts. And this is something that we I think can probably at all levels get better at, is the interjection of real, real kind of financial awareness in the planning and policy area. Let me ask Paul, I want to segue into one other. Paul and I are now seeing each other on panels on a regular basis, so interest of full disclosure. But we talked recently at the Union Club about this 10,000 units of housing idea that I want to broaden the conversation a little bit beyond Boston for a second, because we've alluded to the importance of a kind of sustainable region. And there is there are some real choices facing us with regard to transportation policy, and the governor has really staked out finally. Many of us would say, we've probably been waiting for this for some time, a clear and willingness to raise revenue to support significant transportation infrastructure, or at least resist the backlog, overcome some of the backlog of transportation infrastructure. But as part of that conversation, there's this whole notion of all these gateway cities in Massachusetts, in varying states of underinvestment, or in varying states of being not as successful as they were 100 years ago, 150 years ago in some cases. One of the things that isn't clear yet is how those two conversations relate to one another. Are there places we should be spending, if we're going to spend money on transportation infrastructure, should we be spending more to link Boston with certain gateway cities because the benefit will accrue more quickly, or because the margin, the difference between what the market will build and what we need to have built is smaller? Do you want to clarify a little
Yeah,
bit?
so one of the things we've been working on at my day job over at Mass Inc., which is a nonpartisan think tank up on Beacon Hill. I did not write the report, but know the folks who did, and I can kind of lay out the challenge that we're looking at is, in light of the chronic inability of Massachusetts to build new housing anywhere beyond Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville, because all the zoning and land use decisions lie at the local level, because there's no appetite by folks at the State House to alter that balance of power, concentrating land use at the local level has led the state to vastly underbuild, and the result of that is if you restrict the supply and the demand is, hopefully there's demand because hopefully we have an economy that functions. The end result is you have sky-high housing prices, both on the rental side because the land is so expensive and on the ownership side. Now you have the governor saying we have to build 10,000 condo and apartment units per year just to meet the kind of economic growth targets that we've set for ourselves in the state. And the question is, where are all these units going to go? We haven't done anything to alter the willingness of the cities, of the towns, the suburban towns, to accept more housing. And in a macro standpoint, we really don't want to, because we don't want to create more sprawl. If there's an alternative, which is to use these post-industrial cities that we have scattered around, the Brocktons, the Fall Rivers, Lowells, and Lawrences, places that are desperate for development where land is affordable. But the problem that developers are having is that you can't get enough for the unit to justify the cost of building it. So there's this market gap. The answer to that question that my friends over in the research department have come up with is, we'll just get the state to write a huge check. And that's up to the legislature to decide whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. But there's this, we have this interesting kind of conundrum as we pull back from Boston and Cambridge and look at the state as a whole, which is we need to build housing. We need to build. But the places that we should be building and the places that would love for the development to happen, the private market cannot afford to go in there.
Well, this is I just wanted to tease this last question out at the end of our panel because this is a perfect example of where design and commerce and policy really do come together. And it's a choice that I would love for us as a school, as a college of arts, media, and design to forward and to help shine a light on, because it's really an important one. And so many times the advocates for different investments from the state are often, unfortunately, the people who specifically, personally expect to benefit from such things. And I suppose our role as a university is to try to act in some ways as a public advocate for these kinds of complicated issues that are not easy to understand in the first blush. But I want to thank you all for helping us try to answer some of these. Should we do some questions from the audience? God, I am really doing a bad job of moderating. Please, are there questions from the audience? Maybe yes.
Cover everything.
Jane. You got to turn it on. There you go.
I'm curious if any of you have familiarity or practice with alternative financing mechanisms that other cities are exploring, like microfinancing or compensating developers, compensating public-private partnerships for co-benefits, such as increased air quality or increased lowered health costs in a neighborhood due to a development project. It's not typically practiced in North America, but if we think globally, microfinancing and compensation for co-benefits are models being explored. Thoughts? Would that work in Boston? Do you have experience with it?
You know what? I'll actually chime in on this a little bit, and that is, I think one of the things that it's important for us to understand in the United States is, for good or ill, I mean, our economic model, as it relates to large-scale, regional, national design choices, is just fundamentally different from that of almost every other country, because because we are so structurally disaggregated, and we do not, and there's a significant portion of the population that doesn't believe we should think in a shared way about these things at all. And so, I think there's a number of steps that will happen in the United States, maybe in Portland, before such a thing will occur in a large measure.
In a way, it's moving towards public financing, public partnerships, as opposed to public-private partnerships. Right. And I ask this primarily because it seems in the earlier two panels, technology seemed to be bringing a level of participation to urban governance, urban policy, urban participation that we just don't see in financial models yet in real estate development, redevelopment, and vitalization of cities, particularly Boston.
And I don't know that this quite answers the question, but the change in attitude at Yahoo all of a sudden changes the approach of companies, if others follow, about how much space they need. Because for years, what's been happening is the amount of square feet per person has been shrinking, so that there's a sardining of office space. But part of that was also as a result of people working at home. And so if what she's saying is that I believe that we work better collaboratively, forgetting about what your responsibilities are at home, that has an impact on the built environment.
Can I just throw something in and want to go back to something that Ron said before about the New York Streets study and, questioning whether or not the incentives that they have put out to you make sense. I think
I wasn't doing that. I was.
Or saying you're running the numbers.
No, all I'm saying is that the incentives may be worthwhile, but economically, I'm not sure that the cure isn't worse than the disease.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that this is a question to be put to the regulators, the public sector that issues building permits, and it's a conversation to be had about how do we think differently about mitigation. Going back to the Central Square example, where we're going to trade height not for more money for us, but we're going to trade height for a subsidy for local businesses on the ground floor. We can trade height. I believe the garage where Boston Properties is looking to build in the Back Bay, the BRA had talked in the past about we are willing to trade height for an environmentally advanced building. It's a completely new way of thinking about under what circumstances do we grant height. And I think the answer to your question is it's going to come from public agencies thinking more robustly and more globally about what are we willing to trade for.
Well, it's interesting because the question of incentives is like, of course we have things like we're doing a building right now with a full like solar PV voltaic roof, and we did the environmental calculations and found out that like in a 3-year tax base on the company, we could recoup the entire cost of the PV photovoltaics to basically power the offset is to power the building basically entirely by PV, and it was just a 3-year payback. It was fairly remarkable, but we're in a unique waterfront context with full solar exposure and all this. So the interesting thing I sort of found was that without sort of the incentive characteristics, at least in the development, and it's something very particular to sort of waterfront development, and particularly probably not like building development, but actually sort of landscape and industrial operations, is that because there's almost no specific code, at least the experiences that I had in Chelsea and New York, is that it's become it's very difficult. It's almost impossible for any typical business to do this, but it's a very one at a time analytical of the business process. And I think what was particularly interesting, so there's almost no standard sequence you follow in the mitigation on these properties. There's no equation that even as you start as a business owner, which is very detrimental to the business owner's perspective because it means they don't even know what they're getting into when they start a proposal. In the case of the project we're working on in Chelsea, it's just such a perfect equation for this company that it was just a non-question that they had to expand the property. But what became very interesting was because of this issue of the contradictory legislation, it actually created a unique situation where there was what's referred to as a legislative taking, that there was actually no allowable use of that property. It had been so impacted by laws that there wasn't a single thing that was allowed. And that's, according to our lawyers anyway, that's a very illegal thing to do between the state and the city to basically you as a property. So ironically, the only allowable use of that existing property, it had historically been an asphalt batching plant, which when you're boiling asphalt in a city is quite nasty. So ironically, the only allowable use that someone could have used that property for was to continue boiling asphalt in a high-density residential neighborhood, and we could have opened it on day one. And so as a very complex negotiation, the city was always very aware of that. But we had to then validate ourselves as what's referred to as a less detrimental non-conforming use. So we had to, but the irony was then the city was able to hold us up on that. It was an abandoned or mothballed asphalt terminal. So we had to create a scenario where an active salt dock was less detrimental to a city than a mothballed oil terminal, at which point it became a really dynamic negotiation of environmental considerations, aesthetic considerations, real estate development in the area considerations, because you're trying to take something that has trucks coming in and out of it and argue that as less detrimental to, and the beauty of it as...
Dan, can we infer from what you're saying that we still have some ground to make up on articulating the public interest? If the best way to argue for your project is to say that, don't worry, we're not going to be boiling asphalt here.
That was quite the argument we had to make for 6 years to make the project actually viable. But I think the unique thing on that situation, and I'm certainly not advocating for it, but it created the grounds for a highly customized, highly unique response to a specific business, which is very different than a container terminal, very different than an oil terminal, a cruise ship port, and that it actually gave us the opportunity to design a highly customized. That was a beautiful thing because it meant in the end we have a product that's so unique and so different, and it's going to operate very efficiently to the betterment of the industry and to the betterment of the city. The consequence of that is, and I see this all the time, like what used to be very small entrepreneurs being able to open small-scale shipyards, small-scale boat repair facilities are completely incapable of doing that. Hence we have all of this kind of detritus on the waterfront, which then becomes ripe picking for kind of other types of development. simply because we've created such an I mean, it took 7 years to get the permit to argue that we were less detrimental than, yes, boiling asphalt, which is only going to work for a very unique type of business who has a very unique sort of value added to that facility.
Can we, John, let's ask one, we'll have this as our last question because we've really gone on a bit longer than we should.
Great, thanks, George. What a branding opportunity. We're not an asphalt plant.
Yes, I know, I'm writing it down.
I wanted to ask, and kind of follow up on Ron's last comment around housing and the governor's goal of 10,000 units. And this is probably funny coming from a regulator, but there's been a wonderful alignment between market and sustainability initiatives, especially around where we are growing right now. And it might be coincidence, it might be smart. ULI did this wonderful study on the cost of living in, I don't know, Weston and Jamaica Plain, and said, you know what, you're better off in JP. The houses cost more, but you spend less driving back and forth. And so the market actually probably figured that out before the rest of us. And I'm sitting here thinking about the governor's goal for 10,000 units of housing, and I'm wondering, the public sector likes to spread it around equally. There's a representative for all these areas. So there's a potential to do something wrong, something that is not market right, not sustainable, and that's to sprinkle housing units all over the place, even places where they shouldn't be. Or has the market actually figured this out? So what kind of advice would you guys give to the governor around how best to grow the state of Massachusetts?
I mean, look, we'll find out what the market has to say about all of the conventionally financed housing, which is under construction or to be under construction in Boston in a couple of years. And see how much of it gets rented and how quickly it gets rented. In terms of affordable housing, it's all about NIMBY. And that's what it's always been about. It's not about financing. The people who build that housing for a living, and it's not us, we've done it, we don't do it now, they can do that. They just can't get the land where they can do it in any reasonable period of time. And whether it's 40B or whatever, if it's beyond 40B and you can't get that, it's all about NIMBY. And so I don't think it's about government programs, and I don't think it's about transportation, and I don't think, you know, whether it's transportation-based housing, and sure, build over the T-tracks, and that makes a lot of sense, especially if people are going someplace from someplace which is more suburban. But I think, in my opinion, it's not about the financing, and it's not about the market for affordable housing. I mean, affordable housing, put it almost anywhere, and it's going to lease. I think it's about NIMBY relative to affordable housing.
I generally avoid telling the governor what to do, John, but I like East Boston. And we started a project there in Roseland, finally got that out of the ground, and I got to say, for this room, if you look at a union job and a non-union construction job, I could argue that a lot of units will be coming out of the ground in East Boston already. And I think it's a third rail, quite frankly, about how these projects get put together and what the cost to construct a unit is. And the delta between union and non-union is huge. And so if labor is more creative, that would be a huge, if they're on board with the agenda, that would be a huge...
But do you think, because we had a conversation with Sam Tyler as a group, and we had a conversation about that at the Research Bureau just last Friday, and we determined that it's unrealistic.
Yeah,
unfortunately. I mean, and by the way, you're 100% right about the delta, and besides NIMBY, that would help the affordability of affordable housing, or of all housing.
I just want to make sure in the minutes of the symposium that Paul McMorrow said what I just said, but I just wanted to be sure about that. But so I think but places like East Boston, I mean, they have public transportation, they have available land, they have the kind of land that Dan and I and others might debate about its ultimate use. They're in designated port areas, et cetera, et cetera. There isn't going to be a designated port area type use. But someday I do want to be a less detrimental non-conforming use.
Yes, we all aspire to the same. We've kept you all longer than we said we would. I want to thank you, and I want to thank our panelists very much, really, for excellent discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.